to do is a little overview of my tool system. I have 4 tools. There are 2 straight tools and 2 bent tools. The smaller ones are 1/2 inch square and the larger ones are 5/8 inch square. Now the 1/2 inch square tools will reach about maybe 8 inches off the tool rest, and this 1/2 inch straight tool with the number 1 cutter is what I use for many of my demos where I only use this one tool. And in fact, in this video I'm going to use this as my primary hollowing tool. The bent tools are a little bit different. This one is more bent than the big tool. And what you'll find is that this tool, the small bent tool, is probably a little bit trickier to use. But it's a necessary evil in making the pieces that I make because you do need to have a severe undercut to reach underneath those walls that I make. We make 4 different tips for these tools. They're all interchangeable. The number 1 tool to start out with is this 1/2 inch straight tool with the number 1 cutter. It's the smallest cutter. And these tools are designed to go into these swivel tips and you tighten them down and you can move them around to reach in different areas. Now it's very difficult for me, and that's why I included this section, to tell people which tip to use, because much of it depends on what wood you're cutting. Sometimes with denser, harder wood, you're better off with the little small number 1 cutter tip, whereas with the bigger tips, you may be better off using these for softer wood. There's also differences in the tips. There's a number 1 standard, which is mounted straight, and a number 2 standard. Those are very aggressive. I also make a number 2 that's mounted at an additional negative angle, a 15-degree negative angle, and this is a less aggressive cutter. Some people find that this works as a primary hollowing tip for them. Other people might want to use the negative angle for the less aggressive finishing cuts. And then finally, what I use in all my tools are these M4 powdered metal scrapers. And this scraper fits all 4 tools, and I really don't trust myself to make the final wall thickness cuts on my hollow forms. What I tend to do is go to the scraper when I get near the final wall thickness, because this gives me a good clean cut on the inside and it takes the wall thickness down a little bit slower. Now all 4 tools have a negative angle slot built into the tip, and that's one of the primary features of my tools. These carbide cutters are so aggressive that the way I've solved that problem is by having the cutter tips mounted at a negative angle. So when you take my swivel tips and you put it in there, it actually gives you a downward negative angle and it makes it much less aggressive and you're less likely to get a catch. Now when I make my bigger pieces, like this Buckeye burl piece, I use all 4 of my tools. And what I do is I start out with the smaller tools until they won't reach anymore. And then I go to the bigger tools. What this does is it gives me a little bit more leeway to work through these small natural edge openings as much as I can with the smaller tools until I have to get down toward the bottom with the bigger tools. And I think that makes it a little bit easier to work through some of these smaller openings. These are my 2 straight tools, and these are the tools that I take most of the wood out when I'm hollowing. I only go to the bent tools when I have to. These do most of the work inside the hollow form. This one is the 1/2 inch straight tool, and I have the tip that I recommend with it, the number 1 cutter, and you can see that it swivels and it moves around like this. You can reach wherever you want with it, and then you take the number 25 Torx wrench and tighten it down, and it locks it into place wherever you need it. This number 1 cutter works very well with this 1/2 inch straight tool. I highly recommend this setup if you're just getting started and you want to try what I do. This bigger tool is a much more aggressive tool. I use it for reaching a longer distance. And this one has the standard number 2 cutter mounted in it. And again, they all swivel like this. One of the advantages of the tools that I designed is they're the first swivel tip that I've ever seen that doesn't have anything sticking up. There's nothing to get anything caught on. I call it an internal swivel tip. And you can see there's the angle that they're mounted on. They're sitting inside that slot, which is facing downhill on a negative angle. And that takes away a lot of the aggressiveness and makes them controllable. Okay, these are my 2 bent tools. This is the 1/2 inch bent tool, and what I have mounted in there is the number 2 cutter that's set at a negative angle. This is the negative number 2 cutter. That's important because what it means is that there's an additional angle where that cutter tip is mounted, and it takes away a lot of the aggressiveness. I highly recommend the number 2 negative cutter for both of the bent tools. Now I put a different cutter in this one just to show you, but the bigger bent tool now has the scraper mounted in it. That's my M4 powdered metal scraper, and I really like how that scraper performs with all 4 tools. I put it in this big bent tool just because I had the other one mounted in the small tool, but this scraper is very effective at getting those last finish cuts on all 4 tools. But I do recommend you use the number 2 negative cutter for the bent tools and the standard cutters for the straight tools. Now all of these come with an appropriate size Torx wrench to move the cutter tip. They use a carbide cutter, and when these cutter tips get dull at the tip where you're cutting, what you want to do is take this wrench and move this, loosen it up, and then rotate the cutter to a fresh edge. One thing I do want to caution you on is you want to make sure that you get those little screws cleaned out before you move them. What you want to make sure is by the time you move this little cutter like this, it gets pretty gummed up. And I take a little safety pin in my compressor because you really want to make sure that these little wrenches get seated down properly in there, or you will strip that little screw out. The same goes for the swivel tip screws. When you start to get some wood dust in there, you want to make sure that's nice and clean when you reach in with that Torx wrench like this. Now all of these come with a number 25 Torx wrench like this.